On today's episode, we install our pistons but run into a little bump in the road. We overcome that bump and get this project running in high gear. Part 2 happens now on Project Fast Fish. Here we have a side-by-side comparison of the pistons themselves. Now, the stock 318 came with a bore size of 391, and the stroke on the crank was 331. Now, what you can see here is that there is going to be a little bit of a difference in the compression height because we are going with a 360 crank. The 360 crank has a stroke size of 358. So that's almost a quarter, a little bit more than a quarter overall stroke difference. All right. So in order to compensate for that, we had to go with a piston that had a compression height of only 1,658. All right. So the new pistons then are 3.34 in diameter. It's going to have a stroke of 358 and a new compression height of, again, 1,658. And you can see that difference right here. Here we have the old 318 piston. It sits a little bit higher than, of course, the new one that'll be going in the block. We're measuring out the top ring for the cylinder here. And we used a base calculation of 0.004 times the bore diameter to come up with this figure. And each top ring needs to be set at 16 thousandths for end gap. You'll need two specific tools for this process. You'll need a feeler gauge and a manual piston ring filer. And you'll want to go ahead and set that to 16 thousandths to see where things line up at. All right, so the first thing you're going to do is you're going to take your top ring, place it into the cylinder itself, or the cylinder wall, the sleeve, and then take your piston and drive it down about halfway down the sleeve itself to make sure that you are uniform in there. Take your feeler gauge, slide it in the gap. If it doesn't go down all the way, you need to file. Now remember, when you're doing the filing process, it is much easier to take away metal as opposed to add metal in there. You do have a little bit of wiggle room, but not a whole lot. Once you've done your filing, go ahead and place that back in the cylinder wall. Do that whole piston in the sleeve thing again. Slide your feeler gauge down there to see where you fall. If you fall flush in there, you are good to go. If it doesn't go in there, or if you have to really drive it down hard, you still need to take a little bit more off. And boom, we are set. And you're going to do this for all 8 of the top rings. Now, of course, as we said earlier, based on our calculations, we are doing 16 thousandths for the top ring and 20 thousandths for that secondary ring. That secondary ring calculation is based off of 0.005 or 5 thousandths times the bore diameter. We've got Dad helping us out with the build today, and right now, because these are free floating rods and pins, right? We're just simply giving them a little bit of an assembly lube, inserting the pin and inserting the rod. So as you can see, what he's doing is just taking the moment to lube up the inside really well so that pin slides in. And of course, he lubes up the inside of the rod as well, allowing that pin to slide real easy in there. And of course, the other one to slide straight through and around. And of course, the pins are held by retaining clips, all right? And we got the retaining clips coming in, and they should be arriving soon. And we're going to show you what's involved with assembling the rings and etc. But there you go, the basic assembly for the pistons and rods. So what's the difference between a floating pin and rod and a pressed in? Well, if they are pressed, there's a little bit more friction, and the free floating allows a little bit more freedom, a little bit less resistance for the movement of the rod and in the piston itself. And of course, they don't take the machine work to go and get those in there. But with that in mind, they do require the retainer clips so that they do not move out. Are you going to free up horsepower by doing these? A little bit, I guess. Each people think differently, but for the most part, most higher performance motors go with the free floating. So now that we're getting into the rotating assembly, here's a really important thing to know about it. How you put the rods in is really, really important, right? It goes without saying. But there's an easy way to figure out how they're supposed to line up. Do they go this way? Do they go this way? Do they go that way? Which way do they go, right? Well, inside each rod, you will see that there is a camfer or a chamfer, right? And it is basically, it's a ground piece around the ring itself where it goes into the crank, okay? And the other side has a chamfer as well. You want to find the largest chamfer, in other words, the one that is the widest. Now, if yours are like mine and they've been ground because they've been balanced, hey, by the way, the internals on this thing are all balanced. That's kind of cool, right? It's going to be a little bit more difficult to mark those up. Fortunately, the guy that balanced these for us and got them all lined up for us went ahead and made it easy for us. We just simply matched the numbers up and boom, there you go. So we got rods number 5 and 6, okay? The large chamfer is on, it looks like this side here, and the large chamfer is on that side there, so they would just simply line up accordingly, all right? So the large chamfer goes towards the outside of the crank. So if the crank is going this way, you have your main crank weight, this goes in the middle, allowing the pistons to move up and that chamfer to be where those grooves are on the crank itself. There you go. All right, now it's time to go ahead and set the bearings in place. It's a pretty simple process. If you could put pieces of a puzzle together and match the flat ends and the groove ends, you could do this. All right, so take your cap off, and when you take the cap off, you will notice that there is a flat side and a grooved side, and there's the same thing on your cap. You look here in the camera, if it'll show you, I'm gonna get this thing to focus in real quick. You have the groove side and the flat side. Conveniently, your bearings are the same way. You have your groove side and your flat side. So you got the little groove right there. You're simply going to match your groove in your groove. And the reason they do that is to help keep and prevent spinning, because you don't want these things to spin, especially when you're turning 5,500 RPM. And you can do the same thing on the actual rod side itself. You're going to put that in, whoopsie. And there you go. Now you want to make sure that they are seated properly. So you're going to match groove to groove, thusly, and then lightly torque these guys down. And you're locking them down by light torque, not full torque. You'll torque them to spec once you get them on the crank. So we're just going to give that a quick little click with the impact gun, if we get that sitting in there right. And there we go. All right, so now comes the part where it's kind of important that you get it right. And the reason being is because we're dealing now with the combustion chamber. So we're dealing with the pistons in the combustion chamber. And what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and set our rings in. Now, the rings serve two different functions. One is to make sure that compression and the gases go where they're supposed to go. In other words, when it's combusting, it stays on the upper side of the combustion chamber and doesn't get into the block itself. Two, it helps us keep the oil out of the combustion chamber so it doesn't burn the oil. All right. So what I've done is I went ahead and faced the motor. So think of it like this, right? Let's pretend the front of the engine, the front of the motor is this way, and this is the back of the motor, right? So this is the number 4 piston, so it'll be sitting like this in its V configuration. Notice if it's sitting like this, all right, most of your oils feeding off gravity will go down the combustion cylinder and back into the block itself, all right, and that's very important, especially when it comes time to line up the ring. Also, on your pistons, you're more than likely going to have a little groove indicating the front of the motor, so we're making sure that that stays forward. All right, so what we're going to do here in a minute is we're going to put our oil rings in. All right, and there's going to be 3 different oil rings. We're then going, the oil rings and retainer rings. We're going to put our number 2 ring and our top rings in. And here's how that works. All right, our oil rings. Oopsie. I'll get them out of the box here. All right, our oil rings are pretty much self-explanatory there. You can see that they are grooved. And what we're going to do is we're going to set it up so that The gap here where it splits apart is going to be on the top side of the combustion chamber. All right, why? Well, it's just better that way. All right, so this is pretty easy to set up. Now, when you're putting these in, you want to be careful not to scar up or score up the piston too much, because too much scoring can lead to bad things, right? But inevitably, you're probably going to get some marks on there. That's fine. So here's how that works. All right, you're going to take your ring, set that guy up in there, and it pretty much just snaps into place, just like that. All right, it becomes a little bit more tricky when you're dealing with the other rings for the oil rings themselves. All right, so you're taking two of your oil rings. You got a top oil ring and a bottom oil ring. In other words, one goes on the bottom of that grooved ring, one goes on the top of that grooved ring. All right, what you're going to do here is you're going to set the grooves where they're facing the opposing pins. Here's what I mean by that. Notice the groove here. This bottom groove is going to mesh up with this guy right there on this pin, and then the top groove is going to mesh up with the forward-facing pin. All right, when you're putting these in here, you want to be careful not to bend these too much, or else you'll find yourself binding a whole new set, which can be bad. So there's, you just want to be careful when you do that. So here's how that works. All right, I basically take your piston here, and I'm going to try to keep this in the best angle I can. If I get out of bad angle, I apologize. All right, here we go. Set that groove here, and it's very difficult to do this while keeping in mind for the camera, but that's all part of the gig. All righty, work around. Again, careful not to groove or mar up. If I can get my gloves around that guy, boom, we are in. All right, and we're going to head and kind of sort of get that loosely lined up with that pin. All right, again, we're still facing the forward, and there we go. And our top ring for the oil ring is there, and we're going to do the other one going to the top with the groove facing that way. So we're going to turn that thing around and follow that same process, except for the top ring, and it goes in thusly. Again, trying to keep it for the camera, but it may not work out that way, so we're going to do our best here. All right, and there we go. So again, that forward groove is matched up with that forward-facing arrow. The back groove should be matching up with that pin, and that oil groove should be on the facing the top side of the motor. All right, next one we have ring number two. Ring number two here. Now, ring number two is a little bit thicker. All right, it is the thickest one that we'll be dealing with. Now, usually the secondary rings will have a dot on them. All right, and that dot, you can see that right here. Let me see if I can get the camera to zoom or focus in on that real quick. Is right there where my middle finger is. I'm not being naughty, I promise. We'll go there. All right, and that tells you that that goes towards the combustion side of the piston. All right, and there is going to be a way that we line that up, and those will be basically facing 60 degrees from each other on the from the top ring. So let's get this thing in here, show you what that looks like. These can be a little bit more stubborn to get in because they are a thicker material, but let's see if we can do it in without any real big hiccups. Sorry, camera. All right, and there we go. That guy is in. So this is the top ring. The top ring itself, this particular one does not have an indicator showing you which side is the top or towards the combustion chamber or the bottom. All right. Now some of them do have a marking with the dot on there telling you which way the side is up, right? And those usually indicate a beveled edge on it. In this case, this one does not have a beveled edge. It has a radius edge facing the inside of the ring itself. The outside is square and the inside is rounded on the edge itself. All right, this goes in just like the secondary ring. It's a little bit more giving when you put it in, and thusly a little bit easier to put in. So let's go ahead and get this guy in there, and I'll show you how to line it up. All right, last thing. We're going to show this again when we actually put the pistons inside the combustion chamber, but you want to have the top piston and the secondary piston ring to be not lined up like this, because this would be very bad. This is how gases and combustion gets into the block itself when you lose compression. You don't want that, all right? So you want to have those separated by at least 60 degrees, all right? And we'll show you more about that when it comes time to put that in the block itself, which will be the next step. All right, we're getting ready to put in our cylinders and rods, and what we've done is we went ahead and turned the crank so that the the journal is in the bottommost position. Now, if you look here, if you can see my finger in here, you'll see that we've already put in cylinder number 1, and it's lining up on the forward side of that journal. Now we are putting in cylinder number 2, and I just did this for an example for you so you can see how it goes, right? So cylinder number 2 will line up on this side of the bottom journal. And of course, right now we have the journal in its bottommost position. All right, so you can see we got a tub of oil there, or a small tub of oil, and there's a reason for that, and I'm going to show you why here in a minute. But notice these little yellow doodads on the top of the the bolts themselves. That is to prevent any kind of scoring on the journal of the crank. Okay, so you're gonna make sure that you use those when it's time to install. And right now we are lubing up those bearings with the assembly lube. That way, as we're spinning the motor, because we're gonna have to spin the motor a couple times, everything is set right. Now, what he's doing right now is assessing where in the placement are the rings, making sure that those rings are set at least 60 degrees apart. And you can see right there that where his fingers is, there's one gap. And of course, the other gap is right over there. And of course, you can see the notch for the front that should be facing the front of that motor. And he's going to go ahead and stick it in that tub of oil right there to make sure everything is lubed. And you don't need a whole lot here. You don't need to completely submerge it, because you'll just have a big mess. You just want to get the outsides of the cylinder walls lubed up so that you don't score those when they go inside the cylinder and the cylinder wall. All right, next thing he's using is he's got an old school ring compressor. There's 2 different types of ring compressor. This one's a little bit older, and that's fine. You know, they all serve the same purpose, where they squeeze those compression rings and oil rings in so that you can get them inside the cylinder itself. And that way they are in there without having to do any modifications, etc. There's 2 different types. You see this type right here, that's just kind of old school, and of course the other type is a full sleeve. It doesn't matter which one you use, as long as you can get them in there without having to fuddle with it too much. All right, we're now ready to put that cylinder in. Of course, we're making sure that we're careful on which way that arrow is facing to make sure that it goes towards the center there. And as he's working on that and getting that set in place, and that one went really easy. Sometimes they can be finicky, sometimes they don't get in just right. He's going to go ahead and take the wooden side of a dowel or a schmammer there and go ahead and work that into its position. Now I'm going to go ahead on the bottom here so I can feel where that rod is coming, or that, rod is coming down, and I'm feeling for those little plastic pieces we talked about to make sure they go square around the journal itself, and we're going to go down until such time as it stops. Me being as a guide, it just stopped, and now we get a chance to look on the other side of the motor to go ahead and get that cap secure. All right, now that we are on the bottom side here and we got our camera facing the right way, I'm just going to simply pull off those little yellow tabs there so that we can get to our bolts that are passing through. We're going to take our two nuts along with our cap, and of course make sure that the cap is facing the right direction. Now ours happen to be numbered, so I could just simply match the numbers, but remember those little grooves we were talking about? We want to make sure that we match groove for groove, and boom, there we go. We're going to go ahead and slide that up in there, and it is a little loose, so we're going to have to tighten this down, you know, because you don't want those bearings to slide around. We're not going to do that full torque though, okay? We'll do that when we get the motor turned back to torque the rest of the bolt. But we do want these bolts snug so that those bearings do not spin, because that would create some gouging, which would be a bad thing. So we're going to take and finger tighten this for now, then take our wrench and just simply squeeze those into pit place. Not a lot of torque, just to get them snug. And then of course, since this is the number 3 cylinder, we're going to push this all the way forward. All right, and there you go. All right, so partway into the build, we noticed a little problem. As we were turning the crank to set the next pistons, we came into a little bit of a bindage and couldn't figure out, okay, what's going on. So we stopped right what we were doing, because we don't want to turn it. If we're in any kind of binding, we're like, we got to stop, we got to figure it out. We turned the motor completely over, and we found that the basically the counterweight, or that counter area, the counterbalancer of the crank was actually hitting the piston, number 1 piston and the number 2 piston, in its down position. All right, so obviously right now I don't have the rod on the crank or the rod on the piston itself. But what was happening is, and you can see it here, right? Right now the crank is in its furthest position, or the journal is in its furthest position from on the pull of the actual cylinder itself. And what was happening was, as the cylinder was coming down, okay, it was actually touching the counterweight itself, okay? And it was only minimally doing it. I mean, it was just a little bit of a rub, all right? But here's the thing you got to keep in mind. These are aluminum. This is hardened steel, okay? So, you know, we didn't want to have that rub in there. When you fired the engine up, you'd have that knocking, any kind of vibration. You could throw something out of place, etc. Now, it was only a minimal rub. In fact, that rub only occurred between here and here on the side of the crank. So there's 2 solutions for that. Solution number 1, a lot of the message boards say cut the crank and so on and so forth. In this case, I disagree with that. Why do I disagree with that? And why do, you know, my fellow builder disagree with that? Well, there's 2 reasons. One, this 360 crank is externally balanced, okay? So if you throw and you grind off any of the crank itself, you throw off the balancing, okay? 2, because the pistons themselves are out of aluminum, it's easier to take away from the material at the top of the piston itself, or the bottom side, or near the skirt or the boss area. All right, let me show you what we've done. All right, so what we did, and you might need to do this from your have your machine shop do this, etc. Okay, but what we've done is we have taken our bench belt sander, and we've slowly taken away the extra material here where it was rubbing. All right, this should give that area plenty of clearance. Now notice that there is still plenty of reinforcement for that pin area and the pin boss area for the pull during the second stroke, okay? So there's plenty of material here still left for reinforcing the actual cycling of the cylinder and cylinder walls, all right? So this is the best way to handle that. And because these pistons have already been weighted and balanced, okay, with the rods and such, we are simply going to reweigh each piston to make sure they are within that spec, or that 1/10 of a gram within each other, so we maintain our balance. All right, we didn't want to cut the counterweight because it's much more difficult to balance this thing as opposed to these, which have already been balanced. You can just get these really close. All right, so right now we are grinding that surface away, and then we're going to reassemble and put it back together. But again, if you are doing this assembly fresh from scratch, you want to make sure that you have this area taken care of. You can either do it by hand at your home if you have a bench grinder, or have your machine shop take a look at that and mill those parts out there.